Something interesting is quietly developing inside the Philadelphia Eagles roster as the team moves through the early phase of the 2026 offseason, and one of the most intriguing storylines actually revolves around a player that many fans believed was slowly losing his place in the long-term plans of the team. The player at the center of this discussion is Ringo, and after the first wave of free agency moves, the Eagles might be looking at him in a completely different way than many people expected. When free agency began, the expectation around the roster was that the Eagles would make a few additions, but nothing that would drastically reshape the depth chart. That's pretty much what happened. The front office added role players rather than blockbuster stars. The team brought in Riq Woolen, added Arnold Ebiketie to the pass rush rotation, signed Johnny Munt at tight end, and also brought back Dallas Goedert while extending Jordan Davis. None of these moves completely transformed the identity of the roster, but they did subtly affect the outlook for several players already on the team, and that brings us back to Ringo. For a long time, there was a belief inside the Eagles organization that Ringo could develop into a key piece of the secondary. In fact, the team invested real draft capital to get him, trading a future third-round pick back in 2023 to move up in the fourth round and select him. That kind of move usually signals belief from the front office. The Eagles clearly saw upside in his rare physical traits, elite length, long speed, and the kind of frame that teams love in boundary cornerbacks. Last offseason, the plan seemed fairly clear. The Eagles wanted to see if Ringo could step into a significant role. Instead of aggressively replacing veterans like Darius Slay with big investments, the organization appeared ready to give Ringo an opportunity to grow. They did sign Adoree Jackson on a low-cost deal, but the expectation was that Ringo would compete for the CB3 role behind the starting duo of Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. But things didn't go according to that plan. Jackson ended up beating Ringo for the job early in the season, and when Ringo did get opportunities during the first half of the year, the results were inconsistent. His physical tools were obvious, but the consistency and short area quickness needed to handle quick NFL receivers just weren't there yet. Eventually, he lost the role. Then came the newest development, the Eagles signing Riq Woolen. And on the surface, that move seemed like the final blow to Ringo's chances of developing into a starting boundary corner in Philadelphia. Woolen has a very similar physical profile, long, fast, rangy, and capable of playing outside. Bringing in a player like that naturally raised questions about where Ringo fits now. But here's where the situation starts to get interesting. The Eagles have allowed several safety options in free agency to pass them by. One notable example was Geno Stone signing with the Buffalo Bills, and that was one of the last available free agent safeties who could realistically step in as a clear starter next to Drew Makuba. With Reed Blankenship now with the Houston Texans, the Eagles still have a question mark at that position. Yes, the draft is loaded with safety talent, and the Eagles could easily address the position there in the first few rounds. A trade is also possible, but there's another idea floating around that might sound unconventional at first. What if the Eagles experiment with Ringo at safety? Think about the traits. Ringo has excellent length, strong straight line speed, and over the last couple of seasons, he's improved as a physical tackler. Those are all qualities that can translate well to the safety position, especially in certain defensive looks like cover 2 or when playing closer to the box. And it wouldn't be the first time the Eagles experimented with positional changes in the secondary. In past years, players like Jalen Mills have transitioned between corner and safety roles. Avonte Maddox has also taken snaps at safety during different points of his career when the team needed flexibility in the defensive backfield. On top of that, Ringo has already proven he can contribute on special teams. He's become one of the better gunner players in the league, which already secures his value on game day. So the worst case scenario in experimenting with a position switch is that he remains a strong depth corner and special teams contributor. But if the move actually works, it could unlock a completely new path for him inside the defense. Instead of asking him to mirror quick receivers in tight coverage, the Eagles could allow him to use his length, speed, and physicality in a role that asks him to read the field, attack downhill, and make plays on the ball from deeper alignments. And considering how much the front office invested in drafting him, it wouldn't be surprising if they explored every possible way to maximize his skill set before giving up on his development. So the question now becomes, are the Eagles truly considering a positional shift for Ringo, or will they keep him strictly especially as cornerback depth behind players like Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, and Reek Woolen. What do you think, Eagles fans? Could moving Kelee Ringo to safety actually unlock his potential in this defense? If the Eagles were to seriously explore the possibility of moving Kelee Ringo to safety, it wouldn't be a move made out of desperation. It would actually follow a pattern that this organization has used before when dealing with defensive backs who have elite physical tools but don't perfectly fit the traditional cornerback mold. The reality is that Ringo's biggest strengths have never been his short area quickness or his ability to mirror twitchy wide receivers in tight man coverage. His strengths are his length, his range, his straight line speed, and the physicality he has shown when attacking the ball or making tackles. When you look at the safety position in certain defensive structures, those traits suddenly start to make a lot more sense. Safeties often need the ability to cover ground quickly in deep zones, read the quarterback, and come downhill with force when the play develops in front of them. That kind of role could allow Ringo to play faster and more instinctively without constantly worrying about matching the footwork of elite route runners on the outside. Another detail that makes this conversation interesting is the way the Eagles have approached the safety market so far. Several opportunities passed by during the first wave of free agency, and the team did not aggressively pursue a clear veteran starter to replace Reed Blankenship alongside Drew Makuba. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't add someone later, but it does show that the front office might be comfortable exploring internal options before making another big move. And if you're the coaching staff, you probably look at a player like Ringo and see untapped potential that still hasn't been fully explored. Remember, this is still a relatively young player with rare physical tools. The Eagles believed enough in those tools to trade up and draft him, and organizations typically want to exhaust every developmental path before deciding a player can't fit their long-term plans. There's also the special teams factor that continues to keep Ringo valuable to this roster. Over the past couple of seasons, he has developed into one of the better gunners in football. That role alone gives him weekly game day value. So if the Eagles decide to experiment with him at safety during training camp or preseason, they're not risking his roster spot in the process. At worst, he remains an important special teams contributor and depth defensive back. But if the experiment shows promise, suddenly the Eagles could find themselves with a versatile defensive back who can provide depth at multiple positions. That type of flexibility has always been something this organization values heavily when constructing the back end of the defense. Of course, this entire scenario still comes with plenty of uncertainty. The Eagles could very easily draft a safety early in the upcoming draft class, which many analysts believe is loaded with talent at that position. They could also revisit the trade market if the right opportunity presents itself. And if that happens, the urgency to try Ringo at safety might disappear quickly. But even with those possibilities on the table, the idea itself is intriguing because it represents a potential solution that already exists inside the building. Instead of immediately looking outside the roster, the Eagles might first ask a simple question. Is there a better way to use the tools that Kelee Ringo already has? And sometimes in the NFL, a positional adjustment is exactly what unlocks a player's career. There have been countless examples of defensive backs who struggled at corner before thriving at safety once the responsibilities changed and their strengths were used differently. If the Eagles do decide to test this during off-season practices or training camp, it will be one of the most fascinating developments to watch in the defensive backfield heading into the 2026 season. Because if Ringo adapts well to the role, the Eagles may have quietly solved a roster question without spending another dollar in free agency or another pick in the draft. Another angle that makes this entire situation even more interesting is how the Eagles historically approach player development on defense. This is an organization that rarely gives up quickly on talented players, especially when those players possess elite, measurable traits. Kelee Ringo fits that description perfectly. When the Eagles moved up in the 2023 draft to select him, they weren't simply drafting depth. They were drafting a player they believed could grow into a major contributor in the secondary. That investment still matters today. Front offices often think long-term with players like Ringo. Physical tools such as his size, wingspan, and top-end speed are extremely difficult to find, and when a player has that type of athletic profile, coaching staffs usually want to experiment with different ways to maximize those abilities before moving on. That's why the idea of a potential transition to safety continues to circulate as a possibility worth exploring. From a schematic perspective, there are also certain defensive looks where a player with Ringo's build could be extremely useful. Imagine situations where the Eagles want a bigger defensive back closer to the line of scrimmage, helping in run support while still having the speed to recover in coverage. Ringo has already shown improvement as a tackler over the past couple of seasons, and that physical style of play could translate well if he's asked to come downhill more frequently as a safety. Another factor here is the versatility modern defenses demand. The NFL is constantly evolving, and defensive coordinators increasingly value players who can shift roles depending on the situation. Hybrid defensive backs, players who can align at corner, safety, or even in specialized coverage roles, create flexibility for defensive packages. If Ringo can prove capable of handling safety responsibilities while still maintaining his ability to play corner in certain situations, that versatility alone could make him an extremely valuable piece on game day. At the same time, it's important to remember that none of this is guaranteed. The Eagles still have multiple roster building options ahead of them. The draft remains one of the most obvious paths to addressing the safety position. Many analysts have pointed out that the upcoming class features a deep group of talented safeties, meaning the Eagles could easily find a long-term partner for Drew Makuba through that route. There's also always the possibility of late free agent additions or trades that could reshape the depth chart before the season even begins. The Eagles front office has never been afraid to make a surprise move if they believe it strengthens the roster. But until something like that happens, the conversation about Kelee Ringo remains one of the more intriguing under-the-radar storylines surrounding this team, because sometimes the most interesting roster developments aren't the big headline signings or blockbuster trades. Sometimes they're the quiet adjustments happening behind the scenes as coaches evaluate how to get the most out of the players already in the building. And if the Eagles coaching staff truly believes there's another level to unlock in Ringo's game, exploring a position shift could be the kind of move that changes the trajectory of his career in Philadelphia. Training camp and off-season practices will likely give us the first real clues about how serious this idea might be. If Ringo starts taking reps in different alignments, if coaches begin testing him in safety responsibilities, fans and analysts will immediately take notice. Those small details during camp often reveal a lot about what teams are considering internally. Until then, the situation remains one of the most fascinating developmental questions on the roster. Because the Eagles clearly believed in Kelee Ringo's potential when they drafted him, and the coming months may determine whether that belief can still turn into a significant role within the defense moving forward. So now the real discussion begins among Eagles fans. If the team does experiment with this idea during camp, would you support giving Kelee Ringo a real opportunity at safety, or do you believe his future should remain strictly at cornerback? And if this experiment works, could he actually become an important part of the Eagles' secondary in the 2026 season? There is also another layer to this conversation that Eagles fans should keep in mind, and it has to do with how the organization evaluates patience when developing young defensive players. The Philadelphia Eagles have shown many times in recent years that they are willing to stay committed to players they believe in, even if early results are inconsistent. Development in the NFL rarely happens in a straight line, especially for defensive backs who are asked to process complex offenses while matching elite athletes every single week. That reality is part of why the situation surrounding Kelee Ringo still feels unfinished rather than decided. Even though the addition of Riq Woolen makes the cornerback competition more crowded, it doesn't automatically eliminate Ringo from the long-term conversation. Instead, it may simply force the coaching staff to think